constantly live in the fringe, or like John Bogle, when indexing was the fringe in 1970 and 80, and he propagated this idea, but it then became the herd? How is that the goal? Do you want to sort of have the fringe that becomes the herd, or do you want to just sort of stay perpetually in the fringe? What's the outcome there? I mean,
well, I think as we know, this business is filled with an enormous amount of money. So even the tiddlywinks or breadcrumbs are more than enough for all of us to live off of on the fringes. And I think Bogle, the difference I think with that example of Bogle is he didn't necessarily have an opinion, right? Like he just created a product or a strategy. Like we always talk about, like everybody will talk about different options, strategies, but like no, you're putting on a structure. You're not actually trading a strategy. So Bogle more created a structure. He didn't necessarily create a strategy, and that's why it gained a lot of popularity. But I'll think about it.
I would take that. I
mean, it's a momentum strategy. If that's
help me understand that premise a little bit, because the structure I do get, because he did have a unique structure, but that structure was based on using a market cap weighting scheme for the portfolio, which has a momentum tilt. We agree. But that was pretty unique back then. I mean, that was a fringe idea and a fringe structure that became mainstream. No,
but part of that, I agree with you. But it was like the constraints and the choices they made were not necessarily a strategy. It was like just figuring out what would work to create those index funds. But part of it too is that, as we talked about, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Is like that was a totally different time, right? We're in a much more advanced structure for where people can allocate their assets. So I hope you guys become Vanguard. But I'm just saying it doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't help any of us to think about it that way. Like I'll say it another way is like I always talk about to like long ball managers, right? Is like you're never ever going to be a hero. You need to have some much more like intrinsic motivation than extrinsic, in the sense that like when the good times are rolling, you're just bleeding out and everybody hates you, right? Then the sell-off happens. Let's say you have a convex return. Everybody treats you like an ATM and nobody says thank you. So now you're just losing AUM because you did your job, right? Mm-hmm, so you're like, okay, great. I get no pats on the back either. So great. You come home to your spouse or significant other and you're like, look what I did today. And they don't give a shit either, because your spouse or significant other that's going to be in a relationship with a long volatility person already knows you're a weirdo. And they're like, great, you did your job. So you literally, like, there's no applause, there's no ticker tape parade. Like, you better learn to take a craftsman's perspective of like, this is an artisanal product and I take joy in what I do on a minute by minute basis, because there is no parade here.
We just lost like 30% of long ball managers in our chat.
I don't think there's a dichotomy here, mate. I don't think so either. I think there's a core. There's a core that everybody can adopt and everybody benefits from, and there's an explorer that is zero sum, and that we don't, I'm delighted that very, very few people adopt our approach to harvesting active edges. But I am also all for everybody taking a much broader view of diversification and building a more comprehensive, resilient, diversified core for their portfolio, right? So in sort of a core explorer framework, the core is good for everyone, and the explorer is the fringe, right? Like, it's absurd. Bogle was too successful. He convinced everybody that this bullshit 60-40 portfolio is the only thing that everyone needs to own forever. And he also was extremely home biased. He almost never advocated for global diversification, right? It was extremely US centric. So, Bogle was too successful. He persuaded people of this view, which ex post happened to be right. There was hundreds of Bogles back in the 70s who had a very strong view about the optimal long-term portfolio. They all had made a lot of sense. Harry Brown was out in the 80s, as we both discussed, had a very compelling story and a really good portfolio. And, we're not singing Harry Brown's praises the way that we sing Vanguard's praises, because just ex post, Bogle happened to be right? Buffett was born in the US, so he looks like a genius. If he was born in Japan, we would never know Warren Buffett. He could have outperformed the Nikkei by 8% a year and still have been down for 30 years, right? So there's a lot of approaches to the market. Some of them they gain adoption and they end up being correct ex post. It doesn't mean they were ever the smartest approach. It just means that happened to be the way that the world evolved.
But I've in the narrow constraints that I define this, so that way I can try to win the argument, because I'm using the constraints I'm defining is like, you guys start the defense is on you, is that you guys started this conversation of like, how do we wake up people from their somnambulance? And like Rodrigo's saying is like, I don't want to do that job anymore. And my point is like, you can't convert anybody, and you guys know this. So it's who cares what everybody else does? You're just trying to find the people that agree with you. So like, what are we talking about?
Okay, hold on a second. No, I think this is not a binary decision here, right? That there is. We've talked about this before. I think Mike's talked about it in the past. Adam's talked about it in different podcasts. This idea that yes, indeed, people don't make thoughtful introspection, observations about the market, and then make a smart plan that they execute on. It's crisis, necessity, change, right? And during that crisis, Adam's used this analogy before, that when he had moments of growth was when he was an empty vessel ready to receive, right? And you search something. Terrible happened. A crisis happened in his.
I was about to say, was he open for growth, or he was at such a trough of life that anything would have pulled him out of that trough? So you're overlaying what happened with just peaks and troughs, right?
Again with the turtles.
Is there
He's
any
a smart man? He
reasonable
only found
difference between
a better
those two?
Improvement, a much better approach through thoughtful introspection at that point. But there is a transition moment, right? And there's moments where nobody's in transition, or very few people are in transition, because everything that they've been fed for 40 years has been working, right? And so the idea of education is you're always trying to catch as many people in the transition, that empty vessel willing to change, that horse who is going to the water to drink, in order to maximize getting them to take the red pill that seems to be most congruent with their long-term goals, right? Not get caught up in NFTs, but rather get caught up in, we don't know a lot about the future, let's be diversified and growth, right? Right now, today, we are going through a major structural transition in markets that is creating an opportunity for more vessels being emptied and more people looking for information. And we, together, need to have a biggest microphone to get these people not to blow themselves up in the next hot thing, right? And so I think there's an opportunity here to not just find your people, but rather aim that microphone at a lost group of individuals that are looking for guidance. And we're in a great spot right now to do that. And we're seeing
nobody goes to God on prom night.
Yeah.
Right? The last 10 years have been a series of prom nights. So now we've got some reality kicking in. These are normal markets. The last 10 years are the outlier. So get used to normal markets again. And just that realization alone, I think, can have an enormous impact on people's thinking about their future and how they should approach this, long-term wealth problem.